welcome to everybody, both old-timers now and newcomers to Phraktion webinars. Slightly different branding on this occasion. First to say, Nigel Biswell's will I'll be hosting today's session, which we now brand as peer-to-peer webinars. And I think this really tries to reflect the new Phraktion, if you like, in our development of now over 70 partners globally across all disciplines. And really to reflect that, the exchange of ideas in this community, really at the high levels of expertise and experience we can share amongst the group. And, you know, with a sort of goal that maybe we can begin to shape some of the issues across our industry amongst the Phraktion community. So that's really the change of branding, if you like, around Phraktion's webinars. I should also say up front that we are recording right now. So if you don't want to be recorded, if you don't want to be part of the session, which actually will be used for Phraktion's marketing purposes, potentially in the future, then I'll have to ask you to dial off if that's okay. But if you're willing to continue, we should then introduce the speaker and the session. So today's webinar is entitled, as you can see, we'll be walking the tightrope between clinical trial disclosures and patent filings for late stage assets. And Dr Jen Le Mière will be presenting for us. Again, Jane is an exemplar, if you like, of the high level of expertise and experience available across Phraktion's partner network. She has worked across startup biotech companies, which have led to acquisition, but also in large pharma, including GSK of all places. We didn't cross paths, Jen, I know, but we kind of were there at the same time. As a patent attorney, Jen brings a commercially focused, but yeah, I'd say very practical and pragmatic IP strategy in her work, and that's what she'll share with us today. If you have questions, there is the chat. You can enter your questions there. We'll try to do that during the presentation, but otherwise there'll certainly be Q&A at the end. So with that, you can do a much better introduction to yourself, Jen, I'm sure. Over to you.
Hi, everyone. Thank you so much for joining. Really appreciate it. It's great to be here. Today, as the title says, I'm going to be talking about clinical trials and the pitfalls, some of the mood music of how the US government and European regulatory authorities are seeing some of these things and some of the bits that are going on in the background that might affect our ability to obtain these types of patents in the future. If there's anything that I talk about that doesn't make sense, jump in and ask questions. I'll try and keep it fairly high level, but if I'm pitching it too low, then again, shout. So let's see if the technology works and I can move slides. Uh-oh. There we go. I think that is all good. Okay, so everybody knows we have patents to protect our drugs, and we start with what we generally call the composition of matter patents. So your drug that you're marketing, whether that's a small molecule, whether that's an antibody, a fusion protein, whatever it is. And those patents are often filed really quite early on in the R&D discovery process. Usually it's when you've got a little bit of a hint of activity with some in vitro data. You haven't really necessarily got a proper clinical plan, but that sets your clock ticking for your 20-year monopoly from a patent perspective. And as we know, therapeutics take an awfully long time to develop. There's a really high failure rate, and eventually when you are starting to make some money on it, you're going to have your exclusivity disappear, and that market share will be eroded right at the peak of its sales. And we'll talk about that a little bit more. But even with extensions, so you can get some extensions in Europe, they're called supplementary protection certificates, SPCs, and in the US, you get patent term extension, PTEs. These later patents that we're talking about today can still provide you with lots of years of additional exclusivity over and above a composition of matter, even if it's been extended. So they're really important. I'm going to talk a little bit about Humira, just because I think it's a really interesting example of where these secondary patents can come in and provide extra exclusivity. The first approval in the US of Humira was in December 2002. But the first competition they've had on the US market wasn't until January this year. And that was a biosimilar approved Amjevita by Amgen. So you can see just from those dates, AbbVie have had 20 years, more than 20 years worth of exclusivity on that asset to recruit their costs, to put more money back into funding development of new and different drugs. But interestingly, that product patent, that composition of matter patent that we talked about, expired back in 2016. So the extra exclusivity, where does that come from? That comes from secondary patents, and actually there was an agreement between AbbVie and Amgen as to when they could launch that patent. So some might call that a pay for delay type agreement, or just a patent settlement agreement, parties coming to a commercial solution as to what's going on. But what you can see from the next bit of data is exactly how much that market share was worth. So before Amgen came on the market, 5 billion, a reduction of 41.1% quarter on quarter. And that's global sales rather than US sales. So it's not necessarily just the impact of the biosimilar, but a pretty big proportion of that is down to the competition. And it's actually a fairly similar situation in Europe. If we look at the market share here, before competition, actually in Europe, lots of biosimilars all came on the market at the same time. And the market share for Humira itself going down. This is a slide actually from one of Amgen's presentations. So this is their own data here. And you'll see the dates on this, it's quite different. So rather than 2016, the composition of matter patent, or the 2023 Amgen US entry date, it was actually end of 2018 that the biosimilars came onto the market into Europe. And why is that? Well, I'll hopefully try and give you an insight into why that might be in some of the later slides. So when I'm talking about secondary patents, late stage patents, what sort of things can we actually patent? And I'm sure most of you know all of this, things like formulation developments. So are we going from an IV formulation that's been used in a phase 1 to subcutaneous or oral? Lots of different modes of administration that might come out during development of your drug that you haven't originally planned. Things like subdiseases. What do I mean by subdiseases? I couldn't think of a really good word for subdegrees. What I'm thinking of, you might want to treat asthma, but actually we're really talking about acute asthma attacks rather than a chronic symptom. So sort of nuances on those diseases. Or maybe it's somebody who has a particular disease, but they have previously received, or in fact not received, another type of therapy, or they're refractive to a certain type of other treatment. So it might all be the same disease, but different flavors of those diseases. Dosing regimens can also be super important. You know, you're going through, you've got it approved, and it's once a day, and actually you're going down to once a week. Now that has huge benefits from a patient compliance perspective, as I'm sure you all know. Less frequent dosing, more convenient dosing, better compliance. And then patient populations, you know, we've all heard of HER2 positive breast cancer treatment. So you have a test, you see whether you have a particular characteristic in your disease, and that is a patient subpopulation. And sometimes these discoveries of subpopulations only actually come out after a clinical trial, and you've gone back and done a meta-analysis of looking at the different data that's come in from your big patients or your large number of patients later on. But all of the time, from a patent perspective at least, we're thinking of what's going to end up being on the label. And it's much easier to enforce a patent against a third party when you have a label that needs to be copied. So whether that's the disease, the dosing regimen, the formulation, whatever it is that a biosimilar or a generic needs to copy. And even if it's an innovator situation, like for example, this Amgen Sanofi PCSK9, I can never say that one, always get them the wrong way around. The secondary patents can be super useful, and there's a lot of patent litigation going on between those parties on later stage inventions, not just the base antibody patents. So let's start with Europe, my home place. So I'm a European patent attorney and a UK patent attorney. So I am going to be talking about the US as well. But when we get to that, my disclaimer is that I am not a qualified US attorney, but I know a fair bit from working with my colleagues over there. So to get a patent, you need to be first novel, second inventive, and then you need to fulfill something that's called sufficiency or written description. Those criteria are slightly different. So I'm going to have a slide on each of those three criteria for Europe and for the US. So novel, you're not the same as anybody else. And we talk in patents about prior art. Prior art is just a catch-all term for any and all publication anywhere in the world before the date of filing of your patent. And that includes things like using, so the actual conduct of the clinical trial databases, online disclosures, and clinical trial documents, things that are handed out to patients or generated and submitted. But they must all be in the public domain. And that's really, really key to some of the things that we're going to be talking about. And they can all be treated in a slightly different way or disclose slightly different things, but actually when you put them all together, it can give you a very different story. So for novelty, your prior art, your clinical trial disclosure must actually disclose when you're talking about these secondary patents, so where there is a treatment function in the claim. So for example, drug X for use in 3 times a day treatment of disease X. For it to be novelty destroying, it must disclose an actually efficacious treatment and not just an idea that it might work. And when we say efficacious treatment, we mean actually useful. So we can't take into account a disclosure of something where the treatment is the disease is treated, but everybody dies. So or everybody gets such severe side effects that it's efficacious but equally harmful in a different way. So that's what that second bullet point is talking about. So efficacious and mostly safe for these secondary type patents. So we're not talking composition of matter patents here, where the treatment is part of the claim. And in terms of conduct of the clinical trial itself, we talk about prior use, but as I said, that must be public. So some of the things to think of here is what's public and what's confidential. Are the patients under either an explicit confidentiality agreement, or can that be implied by the way that the conduct of the trial is run? So that's about what actually is happening, how the drug is administered, but also what is the drug. So if your invention is a formulation or a dose, actually if your drug substance per se gets out into the public domain, then that can be a disclosure of that particular formulation or that particular dose. So things like whether the patients can take the drug home. If they can take the drug home, do they have an obligation to bring that back and leftover material is returned or is supposed to be returned to the sponsor of the study? And there's a big drive at the moment for trial participants to discuss studies with family members, but what can they discuss? Is it how they feel, or is it the entire information that you've given them in the clinical trial documents? And if that discussion is not under confidentiality, then that may also be another different public prior use. So there's a fair bit of nuances here around what can be prior art and how it becomes prior art by showing actual efficacy. Moving on to inventive step, and these themes are pretty similar between the US and in Europe. What you need to show is that the skilled person, so this skilled person is this fictitious person or skilled team that we put together under patent law that looks at the prior art, so all of these things that are in the public domain, and tries to decide if there's anything ingenious about what is happening. And if it is ingenious, then you can have a patent. If it's routine and boring, then just a routine development, then you don't get a patent. You're not inventive. And with these types of inventions, is it expected by that skilled team that in light of the protocol or the public prior use that you have had, that you would have that efficacious treatment, that you would expect that drug to work in that dose or in that regimen or with that formulation? And as always, good patent attorney answer, it always depends. But in Europe, actually default position is that a clinical trial is expected to work. We are not in the position, and there's a little quote there at footnote 1, which you probably can't read, but if we wouldn't be putting under ethical considerations and economic, we wouldn't be putting all of this money and effort into running a clinical trial if we didn't think it was going to be effective. If it was just random chance, or we hoped that we would succeed, you know, we've actually got thoughts behind that. So the default position in Europe is that yes, in light of the clinical trial protocol, if it discloses the features that you are claiming, as I say, for example, the formulation or the dose, then it would be expected to work. However, there are always exceptions. So things like, again, the technical term in patent law is there a teaching away? Is there something in the prior art that would lead that skilled team, that skilled person, to think that there was a problem? So, for example, there's a case where the prior art was a combination therapy, and actually a clinical trial protocol was released with a single monotherapy that was one of the two combination drugs. And it was decided in that particular case that you wouldn't expect it, if it was going to work as a monotherapy, surely that would have been tried before you go to a combination. And, you know, in light of all the discussions and the expert testimony, it was decided in that particular case you wouldn't expect the monotherapy to work just because the combination does. Another case is where things might interact with each other, and a very recent case around formulating something in applesauce so it tastes better for children. And actually it was known in that particular field that applesauce or foodstuffs administered with that particular drug may cause issues with its uptake once it's in the gut. And so it wasn't expected necessarily that the formulation in applesauce would work compared to the standard normal formulation, which was not formulated in applesauce. So things like that can really help you overcome this presumption that a clinical trial disclosure will be a reasonable expectation of success. And then we come on to data. Now in Europe, it's a real balance between two different criteria. So one is the inventive step that we've just talked about, and the second one is sufficiency of disclosure. So you need to provide these days credible proof. Gone are the days, long time ago, where you can just file a patent on some sequences and you don't really even know what they do, and you can still get a claim that covers that protein. Those are long gone. You need to have some form of credible proof that the claimed effect, therapeutic effect in these secondary patent cases, is going to be provided by your disclosure. Now, often you're not going to file once you've got the results, because that will then be in the public domain from your clinical trials disclosure, unless you've timed it absolutely perfectly. So if you're filing without results, what can you put down in your application that gives you that reasonable expectation of success, but isn't prior art? So things like your modeling and preclinical animal studies, they're not necessarily going to be in the public domain, but we'll talk about that on the next slide a little bit too. But they give you all the evidence as to why you're running your trial with the doses that you've got. So if you can include those sorts of things that are not prior art, but give you that rationale, and then that will help you to be able to can you still hear me? I think that was my speaker saying, yeah, okay.
Yes, absolutely.
Good. It was just talking at me. And so, yeah, so it's making this story of things that are not based on the prior art that gives you this expectation that your clinical trial protocol is going to be effective, and that you are in fact correct. But this is getting more and more challenging. So, as probably a lot of you will know better than me, there's been a new update to the clinical trials regulations in 2022. And it's getting harder and harder to hide information, hold information back. And the default position is, unless you do something, most of the documents, nearly all of the documents submitted can become immediately public. And you can redact commercially, or supposedly you can redact commercially confidential information. So things that I have done in the past are things like, instead of saying it's a dose of 5 mg per kg, we say it's a low dose or a medium dose or a high dose, without actually giving the specifics of exactly what is going into that patient. But I've actually heard quite a lot of anecdotal situations where companies have tried to redact in that type of way information, but actually the full publication. So you submit two versions, a redacted version and a normal version, and what has been published, despite these rules existing, don't actually, it still publishes the full version. So that's slightly worrying, and I don't believe it's got much better. And at the moment, you can also, well, I say also, they like you to do either redaction or deferral, unless it's really specific situations. You can defer some publication of documents where there is confidential information that's commercially sensitive. And you have to request for each separate document. So your investigation brochure and your IMPD would all have to have separate requests. And they review that request, and it may be denied if there is an overriding public interest, whatever that means. And if you do it too often or too frequently, then they're going to deny that. But I understand that there is a proposal that was introduced in, I think, July this year, that as of next year, they're going to scrap the deferral system entirely. So that would be quite damaging to being able to, if all of the information is published before your trial starts, including your investigator's brochure, then that's going to be quite a big change, I think. So I think that the tide in Europe is they're trying to make it more difficult for us. So take homes from Europe. If you can, from a running a trial perspective, if you can get confidentiality agreements, and I know some people have sort of ethical considerations around whether that's appropriate in all circumstances, make sure you control your drug. And if you can, do it in a secure environment rather than letting patients take things home. Obviously, that will depend on what it is that you're trying to have your trial show. Then those will all help. I think it's really important to, as we go on, review all your clinical trial documentation with your patent attorney, including things like press releases, scientific publications. All of those will build up to a body of prior art that could stop you getting these types of patents in the future, which would be or can be hugely valuable, as we discussed at the beginning. From a patenting perspective, the earlier you file your patent, the less prior art you have, but you risk a lack of sufficiency. So we try and include all these things on the last bullet. So what do we think is going to happen? Why is it going to work? What is our modeling and our preclinical, our animal studies, those sorts of things. And often that is set out in your investigator brochure. And so hopefully working with your patent attorney is not too much extra work to provide them with that sort of information if you are going to be filing. But one word of caution is in your investigator brochure, if you're setting out the nice story as how you got to your drug, and a lot of it's with respect to prior art, that can also then be used against you in the future. Because you've just said, well, I looked at this bit of prior art and I looked at that. And if a court decides that actually none of those steps were inventive, they were just all routine with respect to the prior art. So I think it's really important to include the data that you've generated in-house that's really not in the public domain, that is crucial for this. Also, when it comes to your claims, not just necessarily treating. So you can think about a claim where it says where it treats disease X and the patient shows a reduction in biomarker X in the plasma. Quite often clinical studies look at these sorts of things, and while it might be obvious or there might be a reasonable expectation that it is effective, an alternative question is it reasonably expected that that particular biomarker would be reduced? And that will obviously depend on what is known about the mechanism of your drug and what is in the prior art about that. But those are sorts of things to look at and nuances that you can add to your patent to try and deal with those issues. Moving on to the US super quickly. Novelty is almost identical. So it needs to be efficacious in terms of a prior art disclosure, not just an unproven hypothesis. So the terminology in the case law is slightly different, but it comes down to the same thing. What is out there in the databases or on the documents may become printed publications and used against you also, and confidentiality, just as we discussed in Europe. So the novelty position is pretty similar between the two jurisdictions. What is really interesting and may help explain that Humira situation we talked at the beginning is that you do still need this reasonable expectation of success to be obvious. And in the US, we call it obviousness rather than inventive step, but it's effectively the same thing. But the default position in the US is that there is not a reasonable expectation of success from a hypothesis. And that's quite solidified in the case law. So it's a really different proposition here. And I think that's why it's probably slightly easier in the US to get patents granted. But in the US, litigation is bigger, more expensive, lots more experts than a lot of the different European countries, and it's always fact dependent. So yes, it's easier, but it always comes with a caveat. And data, again, pretty similar. They have two different sections, so insufficiency and its written description here. And it's basically pretty difficult to get a patent in life sciences generally without data in the US, and actually that's true for Europe as well. And breadth of claim is really important. So in the US, they're very much more likely to limit you to what you have shown. And this example here is a classic. It's actually a composition of matter case where the patentee claimed a whole load of different antibodies, but had only shown 3 or 4, and that was deemed to be lacking written description because they hadn't said how to make all of these other antibodies. So you always have to think about breadth of claim in the US. But what's really interesting is what's been happening. It seems like a long time ago, July 2021, when Biden issued this executive order. But there is this real feeling in the US that patentees are being very, very naughty. They throw around words like patent thickets and evergreening. And it seems, as far as I'm aware, there's only one case where it's really been very obvious that the same applicant has made submissions directly to the FDA, completely contradicting what they've said at the patent office. And this executive order was issued a couple of months after that case came to light. And he has asked the USPTO and the FDA to discuss how to cooperate better. And there is a consultation ongoing. So earlier this year, a lot of the industry bodies have submitted comments on some of the things that have been suggested, one of which is increased access to supposedly confidential, although might not be any longer, FDA files by the US Patent Office to see what prior art is being cited. Now, one might say we don't actually need to have any of this because there is already an obligation on patentees to make sure that no inconsistent statements are being made, and the penalty for that is inequitable conduct and an unenforceable patent. So not quite sure what is being achieved here, but there's certainly a real public outcry, I think, as to how patentees are using their secondary patents. And this is just a really interesting outtake from a letter from 2 senators to the Patent Office after Biden's executive order. But they are claiming that there is a clear need for the Patent Office to take action to require applicants to disclose relevant statements that they've made to other agencies. So looks like the US as well as Europe are trying to make it more difficult for us. So take homes, because of this requirement that, to show efficacy in both jurisdictions, probably phase 1 dose ranging studies, we're not showing usually any efficacy in a phase 1 trial. It's only safety. You're pretty safe most of the time to file after the phase 1. But be careful about what you've put in there about doses per se, because the same dose may be, changes in protocol are actually really helpful between phase 1 and phase 2 from a prior art perspective. As I said, be really careful what you put in your regulatory documents. Talk to your patent attorney about that. If you're comparing other products to yours or explaining why you've done what you've done with respect to published documents. And remember, in the US, the litigation process has a lot more discovery. So when we say discovery, we mean the ability of the third party to go through everything you've ever written throughout the whole company that's relevant to this matter. So anything you've written might come out in litigation. The US also has a grace period, which I haven't really talked about, but you can swear behind, you can go 12 months back from a publication in terms of prior art that is your own in the US. So that's great for the US, but it's not going to save you anywhere else. Most other countries don't have such a beneficial or generous grace period in terms of what it shows you. So there are mechanisms that you can use to help in the US with regards to your own publications, but it's not so great for anywhere else. But in the current climate, patenting these secondary inventions will only become more challenging. But I love a challenge. So if anyone wants to talk about any of this anymore, give me a shout, give Phraktion a shout. And if there are any questions, I think I'm 2 minutes over. But if anyone wants to say some questions, then do.
Thank you, Jen, of course, for fascinating insights around the patents and the clinical trial aspects around it, and keeping information safe, if you like. I guess we should open the floor to any questions. There is a chat box, but if you want to come on screen or just tell us your question.
Nigel, if I may.
Yes,
Jen, thank you for a really great presentation. A sort of general question. Often we see as an industry that there's tightening of certain rules, regulations, scrutiny, whatever. And then all of a sudden there's a realization that perhaps medicines aren't reaching certain countries, they're delayed, or there are other either intended or unintended consequences. Where do you see things going over the next sort of few years in terms of the consequences of the mood music that you've mapped out? And what sort of reactions do you think we might see to, almost in 5 years' time, will there be a crikey, there are no new patents and there's no new drugs and we need to do something about it? What's your thoughts?
And that is exactly the position of bio and pharma in that consultation that I mentioned. So that is exactly what they're saying is if we can't do these secondary protections, we don't think that the data exclusivity that is offered by either Europe or the US can't recoup us enough. We're not able to reinvest that money in R&D and the ultimate consequence of that. Obviously, the US government's sort of counter to that is, well, we pay a hell of a lot more for our drugs than anywhere else, so you can't just rely on us, and it can't just be that. But I don't know where it's going to go, but I think in terms of public perception, I don't think there's going to be a sea change in the next 5 to 10 years. I think it's going to be a lot longer than that before people really see whether there's a consequence to this in terms of new drugs coming onto the market or access to existing drugs.
Thank you, Gordon. I have a question online from Tom. Hi, Tom. But Tom's asking, Jen, perhaps you can briefly comment on the labeling on labeling strategy around patents.
And maybe I'll just build on that, Nigel.
Oh, yes, certainly, Tom.
Yeah, if you could just comment explicitly on labeling strategy, on how this may play into protections for patent challenges. I mean, not all the claims make it into labeling, but they'd be available in publications, other potential regulatory documents. But I'm just kind of curious your experience in labeling strategy and how you think about that. Maybe an example or two that.
So the case in the US that really deals with this is Sanofi Watson, and in that case, the label had a cross-reference to a number of clinical trials, and it was deemed that in that particular litigation, that cross-reference brought in the inclusion exclusion criteria and other limitations from that clinical trial, and there was the patent claim had those limitations in the patent claim, and that was deemed to be an inherent feature of the label, which was then copied by the generic. So that, I think, is a really interesting strategy. I don't know how often it happens in terms of cross-reference to clinical trials and clinical trial documentations in those labels, but I think if that's something that parties can do, it sounds like a really sensible way to effectively be able to maximize your ability to do really good patent claims that might not be so obvious and still be sufficient in each jurisdiction. Does that help?
What was the product case you mentioned?
It's Sanofi Watson is the case.
Thank you, Tom. I'm just going left to right on my screen at least. So, hi, Aaron. How are you doing? What question?
Hey, Nigel.
Hi.
Thanks, Jen. I've got a couple of questions. I was just wondering if there's a threshold for subpopulations in terms of the proportion of revenue for a drug, for example. So if you extend your population, your subpopulation, but it's only about 5% of your actual revenue stream, do you get the patent extension covering the other 95% where your drug would be used? And then the second question.
I'm not quite sure I entirely understand. Let me see if I've got it right. So in terms of a patent term extension, so patent term extensions, you're going to test me now. I'd need to look it up to be 100%, but often they are on the composition of matter case. You can only extend one patent case, and you tend to do the one that is going to be most valid, which tends to be your drug per se. So I'm not aware of anyone who has extended using a PTE or an SPC a subpopulation case. So I don't think that has been tested, and I'm not aware of any specific legislation on that. But I can follow up with that if that's something you would like an answer to.
No, just curious. The second question is, I was wondering your thoughts on the Inflation Reduction Act. If a company refuses to negotiate with the FDA and take their drug off the market, do you think you'll see a reduction in the term of the patent in order to ensure that patients continue to receive drug?
So no, not in that mechanism. So the mechanism for getting access to a granted patent is through what's called compulsory licensing. So the government would have to say, and actually that's governed by the TRIPS International Agreement on patent stuff, and it has to be for a medical emergency. Now, you actually do have cases, for example, India, that have claimed that there is a medical emergency in cardiovascular disease, for example, and therefore compulsory licensed. But the international community were pretty outraged at that use of the TRIPS exception for compulsory licensing in that circumstance. So I think for somewhere like the US to do that, it would be pretty risky for them to do that in terms of international outrage and just international obligations. Not that necessarily has stopped governments doing that sort of thing in the past, but I think that would be hard for them.
Okay, thank you.
And the term of a patent, your 20 years and your PTE, is statutorily in law, so they can't just decide to take that away.
Okay, thanks.
Okay. Thank you, Aaron. Let's catch up soon. Moving swiftly on, actually. So is it Yenia?
Oh, hi, Zhenya Antonova. I specialize in health economics and outcomes research. Jen, thank you so much for a great overview. Very nice meeting you. My question is, do these principles apply in addition, besides the drugs themselves, also to medical devices and, say, biomarkers and diagnostic tests? And whether they also apply not only to clinical trials, but also observational research? As we know, observational research in some instances can serve as a foundation for filing patents as well, especially in the case of tests and medical devices.
So I missed the really critical part of your question, which was what is available for the medical devices? What was it you were asking?
No, I'm asking whether the same principles apply, or yeah, it's like it's similar or slightly different for both medical devices and diagnostics.
It's exactly the same, and actually, in terms of diagnostic devices, it's potentially harder, I think, because you have your it's the other way around, right? Because you're effectively the generic when you're looking to is it a 510K possibly? It's not my area of expertise, as you can probably tell, but what you have a predicate device and you have to show substantial similarity to that, and that's one of, rather than going for an entirely new medical device. And there is some case law around actually the prior art being harder where there's a predicate device, because obviously information about that device is in the public domain, so your hurdles can be higher. But in terms of patenting principles, the novelty, the inventive step, that is all exactly the same.
Okay. Well, I mean, it could be not necessarily, you know, something similar already is available, especially in the case of diagnostics. But yeah, I totally understand. Thank you. That's very helpful. So basically, even if it's not a clinical trial, but if it is a study that results in a patent submission, then given that all of the principles of disclosure apply, that would be also expectation of non-randomized clinical trials, but also from observation.
Absolutely. So one of the cases that fed into the confidentiality part of it is a case where somebody gave a drug substance to a researcher, but failed to actually put any confidentiality agreements around that. And it was deemed that that researcher, who had been asked by that company, they argued that there should have been at least implied confidentiality. The court said no. You know, you're actually sophisticated enough that you should have done a proper confidentiality agreement, and that researcher was perfectly capable of analysing that and finding out exactly what was in that formulation and what dose it was, and down that pattern went. So not a clinical trial, but similar principles.
Thank you.
Thank you, Jenny. Just want to check if there's any last questions. Just conscious of time. Matt.
Sorry, a very quick question. And I may have missed it, Jen, but you held me in suspense and you said, why did everybody start in 2018 and not 2016?
So it's that difference for inventive step. In the US, there is no default reasonable expectation of success, whereas in Europe, it is default. So overcoming that inventive step hurdle in Europe was harder, so fewer secondary patents in Europe compared to the US.
And is that usually like a 2-year step? It's just like everybody started exactly 2 years after the patent finished?
Because that's when the secondary patent that was valid finished.
Okay. Okay, thanks. I can rest easy now. Thank you.
Sleep well tonight, Matt.
Perfect.
Very good. So is there any other final questions, comments from the floor? Going, gone.
Thank you so much for listening to me.
Well, indeed, no, it's that I'm sure the pleasure is certainly mine, I'm sure, from across the group, Jen. Again, as I introduced the session, this is, you know, peer-to-peer of real experts. Your presentation, of course, exemplifies that, and also the audience with questions. So I thank everybody for that also. Just to conclude, that Phraktion is still open, of course, to partners. We're looking to build very quickly, so please don't be shy of telling friends, colleagues about us, and also offering from a client perspective as well. If you'd like to discuss any of our expertise across our partner network, we'd be delighted to do that. So please don't be shy. Please bang the drum for Phraktion. That's much appreciated. So with that, once again, thank you very much, Jen. Thank you, everybody, and hope to see you very soon.